Imagine this scenario for a second. You are carrying a really deep, heavy emotional wound, something that has completely fractured your sense of safety in the world. And you do what everyone has been telling you to do. You took this brave step and went to see a professional. But the tools they use make you feel misunderstood, and they start to pathologize your very human, your very normal reaction to an incredibly abnormal world. You go in seeking a lifeline, and then instead you are handed a label. For many people, particularly those from marginalized and displaced communities, it is not some abstract hypothetical scenario. It is the everyday reality of modern mainstream mental health care. Instead of a lifeline, you are handed a label, a diagnosis. It's really heavy. Assalamu alaikum. I am Talha Al-Ali. In our first episode, we unpacked the theoretical landscape of the colonial mind. We talked about mental incubation, how systems of thought were implanted to override ancestral ways of knowing. Today, we move from the philosophy of the mind into the reality of the body. We are stepping into chapter 2, Trauma and the Colonized Mind. As I wrote in the beginning of this chapter, quoting Frantz Fanon, the oppressor seeks to dominate not only the land and resources of the colonized, but also their sense of self, their memory, and their dreams. When we talk about trauma in a decolonized context, we are talking about a collective inheritance. It is a wound that lives not just in individuals' memory, but in the shared consciousness of families and entire cultures. In Western psychology, we are often told that trauma is an event that happened to you, but for communities I work with, and many of you work with, communities shaped by displacement, occupation, and erasure, trauma is the environment they were born into. In this episode, we are going to look at how the trauma is embedded, how it is passed down through the blood, and how we can begin to heal it through dialogue rather than diagnosis. Let's start with a term that is central to this chapter: the othered psyche. It's a loaded term, but it's reality. Clients from colonized or diasporic communities often walk into my room feeling split. They feel a war between the self they know internally and the distorted reflection they see in society. This distortion is fueled by what Edward Said called the Orientalist gaze. The Orientalist gaze is a way of looking at the non-Western world that frames it as irrational, exotic, or fundamentally inferior without the Western intervention. In clinical setting, this gaze is dangerous. When a therapist looks at a client through this lens, they don't see a human in context. They see a case to be solved or a disorder to be managed. Let's take this clinical example, the cost of misdiagnosis. I have seen many clients whose cultural expression of grief or spiritual connection are mislabeled. A therapist who is unfamiliar with the impact of colonialism might see identity confusion, where there is actually structural violence. They might label an inherited grief as a depressive disorder or a spiritual longing as a dissociation. In a decolonized practice, we must change our core question. We stop asking, what is wrong with this client? And we start asking what historical, cultural, and systemic forces have shaped their suffering. This shift allows the client to stop being a patient and start being a narrator of their own story. One of the most important sections of this chapter deals with intergenerational and embodied trauma. We used to think trauma ended with the individual or within the individual who experienced it. But the science of epigenetics now validates what many indigenous and Eastern cultures have known for centuries. Trauma can be inherited, especially from war or displacement, are encoded in our biology. Now moving from that to the cultural bomb. This term comes from the Kenyan writer Ngũgĩ Thiong'o. He describes the cultural bomb as the systemic destruction of people's language, names, and heritage. The goal of the colonizer is to make the colonized see their own history as a wasteland of non-achievement. And there's the vignette that I mentioned in my book, The Irish Ache. I recall a young Irish man in his late 20s who came to me with what he called a constant ache I can't name. He was successful, but he felt he belonged nowhere. We discovered he carried a quiet grief over the loss of the Irish language, Ngũgĩ. His grandparents spoke it, but it wasn't passed down because the British colonial project had associated the language with backwardness and shame. He felt his sadness was a personal failure, but when we reframed it as an ancestral wound, his healing changed. He realized his pain was a generational echo of erasure. For him, reconnecting with Ngũgĩ, reading poetry, joining groups, wasn't just a hobby. It was a therapeutic act of resistance. He wasn't fixing himself, he was restoring a severed root. Now let's move to talk about the body. Colonial trauma lives in the shoulders that tense and the voices that shrink. And I'll bring another example from my book. The Syrian mother I worked with who would startle violently at loud noises. A conventional manual might label her with PTSD or hypervigilance and that's it. But through a decolonized lens, we see that her nervous system is simply fluent in danger. Her startle response is a reasonable survival strategy, giving her past in a war zone, and her present, of course, in an uncertain asylum system in Jordan. And this brings us to survival intelligence. In Western models, we often talk about treatment resistance, but if we look closer, what we call non-compliance is often survival intelligence. For example, a young black woman in Ireland who is labeled as angry and non-compliant by the mental health system. In reality, her anger was her clearest boundary. Her reluctance to open up was what had kept her alive in spaces where her vulnerability was used against her. As therapists, we must depathologize resistance. We need to recognize that sometimes the symptoms, or what we label as symptoms, are the healthiest part of the person. Land, community, and spirituality as medicine. One of the greatest limitations of Western psychology is the assumption that healing happens only inside the individual's head. Decolonized healing requires us to move beyond the individual. Look at the land as a healer. In many cultures, land is not just soil. It is honor, is it ancestry. I had a Kurdish client who found that talk therapy in an office stifling. We moved to park sessions, naming trees in his mother tongue and recalling the sense of his homeland allowed for an embodied reconnection that a clinical room could never provide. Healing is most powerful when it's held in community. A grieving mother might find more peace in a collective mourning ritual. We should see community elders, traditional healers, or spiritual leaders not as add-ons, but as central part of the healing team. We must stop pathologizing spirituality or labeling it as superstition. If a client mentions a dream of ancestors, we don't screen them for psychosis. We ask, what wisdom does this dream carry? What wisdom does this dream carry? What healing can it offer? This approach honors the metaphysical language people use to make sense of their suffering and of their world. And this is one of the main things that Western traditional educational institutions lack. Teaching and training psychotherapy students how to navigate spirituality within the therapy room. And the end of this episode is meant to carry us from diagnosis to decolonial dialogue. So to wrap up this episode, I want to leave you with a shift in language. When we diagnose, we name a pattern. But when we decolonize, we uncover the narrative beneath the pattern. I remember an Iraqi refugee who asked me, I'm supposed to be broken, right? That's why I am in this room. He had internalized a colonial script that said refugee equals damaged. Our work was to document his resistance, his ability to translate for his family, his skills in navigating hostile systems. These were not just coping mechanisms, they were everyday revolutions. Decolonized psychotherapy is a return to relationality, land, and justice. It reminds us that our clients are not passive recipients of treatment. They are survivors, narrators, and ancestors in the making. Thank you for staying with me for this deep dive into body and blood. In the next episode, we will move into Chapter 3, exploring the practical foundations, principles, and tools for building a truly decolonized practice. Stay with the work. Healing is a lifelong process of returning.